Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. I'm your host, Harvey Bracken-Smith, and today I'm honoured to be joined by Bill Adair. Bill is the Knight Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy and the creator of the Pulitzer Prize-winning PolitiFact. He has worked for 24 years as a reporter and editor for the Tampa Bay Times and is the co-founder of the International Fact-Checking Network, the global association of fact-checking organizations. I feel incredibly honoured to speak to Bill today. And as I was mentioning just before, it's probably weird for him being on the other side of the question asking. But I wanted to start off by asking you, Bill, why and how you got into journalism.
Well, I did it because my mom told me to. When I was 12 years old, I had to do a career report in grade school, and right about that time, my mom had said, you should be a reporter, and so I took that literally and was like, okay. And I did my career report on journalism, and I still have that career report. And one of the things it says that's very true about journalism is that to be a good journalist, you need to be curious. And I think that really is at the heart of a good journalist. And it was something I wrote then as a whatever 12, 13-year old. And it's still very true today for me. It's really at the heart of my fact checking, which we can get into. And
Of course.
and I think it's just what drives me and everything I do is just curiosity, wondering about the world and wanting to understand it and understand people and tell their stories. And so when I went to high school, I got involved in the student newspaper. I started working for a local newspaper on Saturdays, working in the newsroom, opening the mail, and writing weather stories. It was in Phoenix, Arizona, so the weather was really boring because every weather story said it's going to be sunny and hot. Uh, so I also did. I wrote obituaries, which is a great way to learn the basics of journalism. And anyway, so that's one way. Another thing that got me into journalism was two important things about investigative journalism. One was the death of a investigative reporter named Don Bowles. Don Bowles was an investigative reporter for the Arizona Republic. And as I was graduating from eighth grade, which in Phoenix, Arizona was a big deal right before you went to high school, Don Bowles was going to visit a source at a Phoenix hotel and met with this source and came back to his car and started the engine, and the car blew up because there was a bomb that had been placed underneath it. And he lived for about 2 weeks and then died. And I think he died on the day that I graduated. And I remember that so vividly because it showed to me that journalism matters, that someone cared enough about the work that Don Bowles was doing, and he was investigating organized crime in Arizona, that they wanted to kill him. And later, I saw the car in the museum, which was a museum to journalism in Washington, D.C., and it was very powerful and very moving to see it because that it had been such an important symbol for me of journalism. The other thing that happened a little bit on the lighter side was a film called All the President's Men, which was about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, reporters at the Washington Post who broke the Watergate story in the early 1970s. And their reporting led to the resignation of President Nixon. And the film's considered one of the great films great American films ever made, and directed by Alan J. Pakula, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. And I've seen that film more times than I'd like to admit. I sometimes require my students to watch it. And that film came out about the same time, about the time I graduated from 8th grade. And it really showed a romantic side, not romance like love, but a the drama of journalism, and how again, like with Don Bowles, how important journalism could be. Also, it showed how good looking journalists could be, because Robert Redford was considered like one of the best looking actors of the era, and as was Dustin Hoffman. And so I thought, well, if I become a reporter, I can be really good looking. And so I really loved that film, have seen it, as I said, so many times, and have talked to Bob Woodward, the real Bob Woodward, a few times. And he spoke to my class last year, and he was tremendous. He was very inspiring to my students, and it was just wonderful to get to talk to him and see him inspire a whole new generation of student journalists.
I can sort of understand the idea of seeing that film and then being really good looking and exposing this scandal, and hopefully
Unfortunately,
not die.
I didn't turn out to be very good looking. So it turned out that was not true. But I at least could dream back then.
No, we're gonna add some filters there. We have face tuning, and
Good.
so
Yeah,
yeah, we're
Robert
gonna fix
Redford's
that.
face up here.
And then we're gonna get a photo of you on PolitiFact, and it's gonna say if it's true or not. So
Right.
we're gonna see what happens there. But I was gonna say I kind of get the seeing the actor being young. It's really cool to be a journalist at that point in time. But the Dan Bowles story, I mean, it sounds incredible, but seeing him literally having died by exposing a story, why did that motivate you to being a journalist? I feel for a lot of people, that would probably push them away, like, they're doing bad things, stay away from them. They can, end your life. So why do you think it gravitated it towards you rather than away from it?
Well, I think I I think anyone who gets into journalism does it to some extent because it's a cause. They're doing it because um they're not doing it for the money. I mean, even though I joke with my students, I always say to my students, if you get into journalism, you become very rich. And there is, of course, irony in that, because journalists are typically not highly paid unless you work for a television network. Um, so so to get into journalism, I think people like me are driven by other motivations other than high salaries. And I think the idea of uncovering corruption and doing good and holding power to account is a great motivator. And so even then, as a 12-year-old, I looked at this and I thought, wow, this stuff matters. And, it's not that I wanted to get blown up, obviously, but it was definitely a sign that journalism is important, and that appealed to me, to do something that mattered.
And then, so you then transitioned, if I'm correct, into aviation journalism. I mean, I kind of get the fact checking leads to fact checking, but where does the aviation come into all of this? It seems like
Um,
I don't know, was it a plane crash? Was Dan Bowles actually in a plane crash? Like, how does that all link together?
so my career, so I went to Arizona State University, and got a good education, and then when I graduated, moved to Washington, um, messed around for a year trying political communication, but didn't particularly like it, and then worked for a suburban paper in Northern Virginia, and found that I really liked covering transportation in general, not just aviation, but also highways and roads. And I liked that as a beat because it had different elements to it. It had politics because road building involved state and local politics. It had drama because there were sometimes these tragic accidents that needed to be explained to readers, and then there were issues of what could government do better to make highways and flying safer. So I started off covering a little bit of aviation there, and then when I moved to the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, I moved as quickly as I could to covering aviation. And so I covered all aspects of aviation. I covered the airline business. I covered aviation safety, and then whenever there was a major accident, and there were many more plane crashes back then in the 1990s, I would often go to them around the country. So I would go to places like Newport, Rhode Island, and New York City, and Little Rock, Arkansas, when there was an accident. And so it was a fascinating beat because there were so many intersecting forces involved in investigating an aviation accident, and I was really interested in how the government investigators worked. So, the National Transportation Safety Board is an independent agency in the federal government, very unique. It does not have regulatory power. It works independent of the Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration, but it has tremendous influence in getting the DOT and the FAA to improve rules and regulations of airplanes and highway safety. So, and I was fascinated by the things that the NTSB did to investigate a plane crash. And my editor was also very interested in aviation, and she said to me once, if you ever find an aviation accident that you want to really dig into and write about, I will give you the time to do it. So in 1994, there was a plane crash in Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania, of a U.S. Air Boeing 737, Flight 427. And it turned out that a couple of the investigators were actually from St. Petersburg, Florida, where I worked at the time. And and that gave me some access to people working on the investigation. And it ended up that accident, this plane crash where a plane was coming into land at the Pittsburgh airport, became the greatest mystery in aviation. The investigators knew how the plane crashed, but they didn't know why. The plane had encountered wake turbulence from another plane. There was a sudden rudder movement, and then the plane suddenly just plunged to the ground. So it was a tremendous mystery. Well, it was a great story, and I just was fascinated trying to explore how they were telling it. So it really, covering aviation with that, and I ended up writing a book about it called The Mystery of Flight 427. Just telling that really appealed to, again, getting back to my curiosity, trying to understand how planes worked, what the pilots might have done, whether the plane might have malfunctioned, how we could make planes safer so this didn't happen again. And it was very dramatic because the Boeing 737 was the most widely used plane in the world. So anyway, I loved covering aviation. Ultimately, though, and it's a tremendous success story, aviation got a lot safer. if you look at the number of plane crashes in the 1990s, um, there were a fair number. Um,
Mm.
but the number of crashes really dried up in after about 2001, and we rarely have a major plane crash these days. And when we do, it's often some bizarre thing like the disappearance of the Malaysian plane. So, um, and that's such a rare event. I can't even remember the last major accident. Maybe the Boeing 737 accident in Africa. So it's a pretty rare thing now. And so I realized I needed to find a different beat. And so I moved to covering politics, because I knew that politics was always going to be there and there would always be things to write about.
Why do you think people are so gripped by plane crashes? And then, kind of like on top of that, I've seen a lot of conspiracy theories, about government and whatnot, but also about plane crashes. Why are people so like entrenched with this like idea of there must have been something wrong going on with each and every plane crash, and then they spend hours and hours digging online and forming these sub communities on the internet and in person, thinking that there's been some form of malpractice going on.
I think that when you are flying, it's one of the rare times in your daily life that you give up control and your safety to someone else. I mean, if you think about it, when you climb onto that plane and say, okay, take me to New York City, um, you are surrendering your safety to that pilot and that airline and trusting that they're going to get you there safe. And you are in an aluminum tube that is going to fly at 35,000 feet at 400 or 500 miles an hour, um, and get you there. And pretty much every time it's going to succeed. That's remarkable, but it is a rare moment in your day or week or month that you are surrendering yourself that way. And so I think that that creates this opportunity for conspiracy theories to thrive, and um, because there's just this, oh my God, something might happen, fear that we all have lingering somehow.
I think what's interesting about your story and kind of comparing it to other careers, because I've interviewed people that have reached the peaks of their career as an actress or an athlete or a CEO or founder, and a lot of those people kind of started off, not really being something, and then they win a competition or they some play that they did suddenly takes off or whatnot. But for you, you were already kind of at the top of the journalism realm before you started PolitiFact. I mean, you had kind of rise through the ranks. So I was wondering if you could explain to me what the world and realm of journalism is like how you rise up the ranks. Is it about the number of views you get? Is it about the stories you cover? Is it about, do you have to stay on a certain track if the paper is or more left leaning or more right leaning, and how much autonomy you really have in covering the stories that you really want to cover?
Well, that's very generous of you to say. I'm not sure I've ever achieved the top. I've had some wonderful jobs, and I sort of think of my career in chapters, um, uh, or big long chapters. The first chapter was um, local journalism, and I got to do some really fascinating things. First in Northern Virginia for the Fairfax Journal, and then in Florida for the St. Petersburg Times, which is now known as the Tampa Bay Times. And I loved that. I loved covering local news, whether it was um, local government, state government. I got to cover state politics. I got to cover um, disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes. I seem to always be the reporter who got sent to the Florida Panhandle when there were hurricanes coming through. So I loved that part of it, just the excitement of being a breaking news reporter. When I went to Washington, I became a political reporter, and and then I became an aviation reporter and covered the airlines and aviation safety, and we just talked about that. Then I went to Washington, sort of concluded my time as an aviation writer, and pivoted to covering politics. That was fascinating. And I covered it differently. I didn't, and I think one of the things I've always tried to do to stay fresh is to sort of look for different kinds of stories than other journalists. And that is as much for my own satisfaction, because I just don't want to do the routine. So when I was covering local transportation, I wrote a story, "Do red cars get more speeding tickets?" And this, is an old suspicion, like, the police, they give more speeding tickets to red cars.
Yeah.
And, so my curiosity was like, well, really? And so I figured out a methodology to test that, and stood on street corners to count cars and compared it to the speeding tickets in the county courthouse. And is it true? Kinda. There was like red cars got slightly more speeding tickets than they represented in the fleet, but not that many more. Um, so, but in Washington, I covered different kinds of stories. So I covered the White House, but instead of like writing every day what President Bush did, President George W. Bush, I would write unusual stories, like how do they stage a campaign event, or um, sort of a day in the life kinds of stories. I would do on Capitol Hill a day in the life of the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, the guy who everybody asks for money. So I just hung out with him for a day and watched people ask him for money. And that was a blast. And it was very revealing about how American politics works. I mean, this was back when Congress was more functional and the appropriations committees were more important. And just person after person after person came to this guy and was like, hey, can you give me money? And then the story ended with his son saying, "Hey, Dad, can I have some money for the vending machine?" And so it was just a perfect, ending for that story. So I've always tried to do things a little bit differently. So then when I got into, and that, like I said, and that's, I don't know if that's a career strategy. That's an anti-boredom strategy. Like
Yeah.
I just I don't want to be bored. I don't want to be doing, I mean, one of my secrets, I don't know if I've ever told my editors this, but so when you're a reporter from Florida, from a Florida newspaper, the big story is to cover the federal money that is used for um, the water projects in the Everglades. Because one thing about the Everglades, to keep the Everglades healthy, is there's all these um, uh, channels and things to sort of keep the water flowing properly. And just tons of bills along this and whatever. And it's very important and incredibly boring. So one of my goals when I got to Washington was to never write about the Everglades. And so I didn't tell my editors that, but I was like, in all my time here, I am never going to write about the Everglades. One time I was on Air Force One with a reporter from the Washington Post, Mike Allen, who's now at Axios. And Mike got on the plane and we're talking, and Mike had this big stack of papers, and like a bunch of them were about the Everglades. And he's like, I think President Clinton's going to talk about the Everglades today. And I was like, Uh-oh, because I don't know anything about the Everglades. Um, So, anyway, success. I went all my time in Washington without ever writing about the Everglades. And I think our readers were fine with that because, like, if they wanted to know about the Everglades, they could look it up. But instead, I wrote stories about interesting stuff that I think people cared about. And so, and in addition to interesting feature stories, I did investigative reporting. I wrote about a congresswoman from Jacksonville who um, uh, had done some really questionable things and ended up being sent to prison. So, so I was very proud of the investigative work I did, and then, pivoted to fact checking and even did that in a different way. So, anyway, the key for me was don't be bored.
So I'm from this little island called Jersey in the Channel Islands near France. And then I went to boarding school in England, and now obviously I'm studying at Duke University in the US. So I've kind of been in different areas of the world and kind of, interact with different people who had different opinions and whatnot. But I'm 20 years old now, and I can remember 10 years ago, no, maybe it was like 7 years ago, I was leaving my school in Jersey, about to go off to boarding school. Sort of classes and exams were all finished, and our teachers like took us into like a room, and they were like giving us some educational stuff for the outside world before we left school. And I remember she was telling us this story about how the news, how we had to like use our own conscience to be like, is this news or is this article or thing we read online actually true? And to be honest, I'd never like I'd seen, you have these nonsense articles online, but I'd never actually considered in my life this person online who could have a lot of followers or a following or some position of power could be lying to me. And I think it could be particularly scary as a young kid when you're put in these environments, these schools, where you're just taking in and feeding in information to now think at, what, 13 years old, that what I could have been told for the past 13 years of my life, much of it can be filled with political opinion or, full of like lies just to advance people's own self-interest. And so that was the first time I was like, geez. And then my school was pretty well known as well. And every single article, no matter what it was about, would mention how much the school cost every year. And then this article, you'd have about 10 different articles about each topic, and each would show up a different point of view. And now I'm in America, which just seems absolutely insane. One issue, and both parties and both sides seem like they're in the right, and then both spread nonsense and whatnot. But I can very much see where the passion comes from your side, and I hope I've shown in my story like why I now also think it's important. But I'd love if you could take me back to the year of when you founded PolitiFact, of why you thought you needed an independent like site or thing to actually establish this practice of telling the truth and holding politicians and people of importance to account, and then how you went from that idea to actually making it into a thing and a sustainable thing that's now working in 2024.
Sure. So it actually began with a speech to the Republican National Convention in 2004 by a guy named Zell Miller. Zell Miller was a Democrat, a senator from Georgia, and he gave a speech about his Democratic colleague, John Kerry, who was the Democratic nominee. And Zell Miller was the most prominent Democrat to endorse President Bush, the Republican. And Zell Miller said a bunch of things that I knew were at best half true. And I was there and I was writing about something different that day. I think I was writing about Vice President Cheney. And but I thought, we should be fact checking this. And there was some fact checking back then in 2004, but not much. And I felt like I should have done that. So in the next couple of years, I did some fact checking in different areas, claims about climate change, and I started to get interested in doing it on a more sustained basis. So I went to my editors in probably late 2006, maybe early 2007, and I said, hey, let's start a fact-checking site because we should be doing this. And so it was really my own guilt that I felt like this was what I should be doing. And I was willing to make it my new career. And the beauty of working for this marvelous newspaper, the Tampa Bay Times, then the St. Petersburg Times, is that if you had a cool idea, they would let you do it. So if I said, hey, I want to write about a plane crash, they'd be like, okay. And so this was not a fight. Like, it wasn't like, please let me do this. No, young man, you must write about the Everglades. It was like, hey, I want to start a fact-checking website. And they were like, okay. So it was marvelous. And they were willing to give me a couple of reporters to help. And the next thing you know, we were designing the site, and we had this marvelous designer who came up with this very clear web design that was revolutionary. Because what was different, there had been some fact checking. There was a great fact checker, factcheck.org, back then. But what was revolutionary that we did was we compiled fact checks by person. So you could look at all of Mitt Romney's fact checks and see how many true, how many half true, how many false ratings did he have. And so it was, if you go back to my whole goal for getting into this business, it was a way to hold politicians accountable for what they said. And so you could go to their report cards and see, oh, how do they stack up and how do they compare? And there was a real, I just thought that was the coolest thing. And that was, I got a lot of help for that from a guy named Matt Waite, who was uh, uh, helped build the back end of PolitiFact. So um, uh, the that sparked a whole fact checking boom in the United States because others were like, "Oh, well, we should do this too." And so a lot of them adopted rating systems similar to PolitiFact. So PolitiFact, we had the truthometer, which had been my concept. I was not the first person to use the term truthometer, but we were the first to do it in a sustained way and to do it in a way that compiled report cards. And so so there became this little boomlet of fact-checking sites in the United States and then around the world. So it was really rewarding to see that happen and to see that my own guilt from 2004 sort of sparked this. It was made possible because of talented people at the St. Petersburg Times and a culture that allowed you to be creative. And I can't emphasize that enough. A lot of people say, how did you do PolitiFact? Well, I didn't do PolitiFact. A bunch of us did PolitiFact. And the culture of the Times made it possible. Uh, you can work for lots of different companies. The ones that really succeed are the ones that have a culture that encourages creativity and is willing to let you take a risk. So I propose this pretty out there idea for a regional newspaper in St. Petersburg, Florida. And so they not only let me do it, they gave me the resources to do it, but all along we said, hey, if this thing fails, I'll just go back to covering politics and we'll scrap the whole thing. And we set little deadlines that hey, if it doesn't work, by the Florida primary, I'll just go back to covering the campaign. So it was pretty cool, the way it all came together. And then it succeeded, and then we kept it going through the campaign, and then we liked it a lot. So then we started fact checking people in media, and then we won a Pulitzer Prize, and things kind of built on each other. So it turned out really well.
You say it went really well. And I hate to be the devil's advocate here. The site is amazing. It obviously won a prize. All like the critics like, wow, awesome site. But we're in 2024 in what people are still calling, as I'm sure they do at every election, the most important election of your lifetimes.
Right.
But, and I'm sure you've probably got a lot to say on that, but politicians are still
This
lying.
one really is the most important election of our lifetime. But yeah.
We'll get on to that. We'll get on to that. But politicians are still saying, well, they're still lying. Sure, I mean, you've written a book, which I'll let you talk about as well, I'd love you to talk about. But as well, politicians are still lying, and there's some reasoning about why they lie. So even with this site, which is holding them to account, is it really holding them to account? Are their
Right.
followers still just going to blindly follow them no matter what they say? Does it help convince them to follow them? Is lies what makes someone want to vote for someone? Is it an inevitable part of the process? I'd love if you could, help walk us through that journey from someone on the
Right.
outside that's like, what the fuck is going on, basically, to why they're
Yeah.
doing it, and then how you actually hold them to account.
Yeah, some success you are, Adair. Like you start this website and there's more lying than ever.
I'm sorry.
To just sum up your question. So I think that's a legitimate question. So what's happened? There was a period in 2007, and I have other old guy friends who remember it this way. In 2007, when PolitiFact started, and when Facebook was just starting, and the iPhone was just introduced. The iPhone was introduced same year as PolitiFact. There was this moment where a lot of us who were working in tech and web publishing thought, wow, this is like a breakthrough moment the in the arc of humanity, and we can inform people in wonderful, positive ways that have never been possible. And I remember having tremendous optimism about that. A friend at Google, one of the senior people at Google, and I've shared this, and he had the same, like, yeah, there was this moment back then when I think we thought that the truth could win. Um, so, um, so what happened? Well, there has been a lot of really good journalism, and we have found good and powerful ways to get the journalism to new audiences and counteract the falsehoods. And so I think fact checking has been a great service to lots of people. Why is there still so much lying? So there are a lot of different reasons, and I talk about them in my book. The A lot of them have nothing to do with technology. In the United States, political gerrymandering, the way that congressional districts and legislative districts are drawn, has allowed representatives to no longer have mixed constituencies, so they can play to the extremes. And in fact, their voters elect extremists on both sides. So that has counteracted to a large extent what the fact checkers have done, because you have these extreme partisans who have less regard for the middle and less concern for what the middle thinks. And that means that they care less about journalism and what journalism says. So that's a factor. In concert with that, you've had fragmentation of the media and a decline in local media and a rise of partisan media, and that working in concert with with gerrymandered legislative districts, so it just feeds these hyper partisan people these tasty partisan treats every day. So if you watch some of these partisan networks, you're getting such a skewed view of the world. And that's hard to overcome with facts, particularly the right. So fact checking is much more popular on the left than it is on the right, because viewers and readers on the right get a constant diet of messages that discredit fact checking, that attack fact checking, that say fact checking is the liberal media, that fact checking is an arm of the Democratic Party. And so just as people on the right are told not to trust the nonpartisan media, they're told not to trust political fact checkers who also are nonpartisan. So that allows falsehoods to flourish, particularly on the right, and studies have consistently shown more conspiracy theories, more people on the right believing conspiracy theories. My research for my book, Beyond the Big Lie, showed Republican politicians with considerably more false ratings from PolitiFact and the Washington Post fact checker than Democrats. So that's why we are where we are. And it can be depressing, that you see this and you're just like, oh my gosh, the fact checkers are doing all this work and it ain't working. So yeah, it's after all these years, to quote Simon and Garfunkel, after changes upon changes, we are more or less the same. And we need to be more, we need a kind of fundamental change to change people's attitudes about lying in politics.
I wanted to ask you about like the US specifically and then take that out into the broader world. But I kind of feel like this is a global issue. Even in the UK, it was kind of seen as the Labour Party would come in and overtake the Conservatives, and suddenly every issue that every person had would be fixed. Because every voter has their own idea of what the US or what the UK or, what their government and what their state should look like. And each candidate on both sides is trying to have some form of catch-all to be like, you want the economy fixed? We'll fix that. You want racism fixed? We'll fix that. You want this fixed? We'll fix that. And then they get into power, one or two things happen, and then it either doesn't happen, the voters are still dissatisfied, and then they might switch to the other party or they'll stay the same, hoping that some new candidate will fix it. So my question is to you, can this political system be fixed? In which people are lying, in which people are dissatisfied, in which voters feel like nothing is really happening. Can it be fixed, or is this just an inevitable problem of our society in the US and in the wider world?
Well, there have always, and I think it's important to distinguish between campaign promises that are unrealistic and don't get kept, and lying. So at PolitiFact, we have two different meters, fictional devices, as my successor Angie Holland used to say. The truth-o-meter is an imaginary device, but we had two different things that assessed those two different concepts. One is this statement true? Where we would do journalism on that, and then we would assess it and give it a rating from true to pants on fire. And then campaign promises, we also would assess and track in ways that no other journalism organization ever did. So, do politicians keep their promises? That's an important thing to follow. And we did that too in ways that no one else ever did. Wasn't very sexy. It didn't get as many clicks, but it was great journalism. I was very proud of it. And the first one was called the Obameter, and then we did other ones. So, so those are two different things. Um, let's take them separately. So, promises not kept. In a way, that's easier. Like, good journalism and like politicians, we can assess. Hey, did the Tories keep their promise when they were in charge? Of course, the way that Britain burns through political parties, like how it's hard to keep track. I mean, they just keep the turnover is so rapid. But anyway, those are good journalistic exercises to hold parties accountable for what they promise. Separate thing, lying in politics. I think that's a bigger problem, because lies have a much more direct effect on people's lives. This week, the week we're recording this interview, terrible flooding in Western North Carolina. Horrible event, made worse by misinformation and conspiracy theories about the recovery, about what might happen. There was a false rumor that dams were breaking. Horrible things that affect people's behavior and make people freak out. That doesn't happen because some Labor Party official says they're gonna do something and they don't. So I just think lying and misinformation is a bigger problem. So in my book, one of the last chapters, I talk about, well, what can we do about lying? And I try to step back and look at lying in a broad way. And maybe we can probably use this as our last thing to talk about here. So lying is like a political economy. Politicians lie because they believe it pays off. They are about to say something and they make a calculation. If I say this thing that's not true, I'm going to gain from it support from my supporters. It's going to make them feel good. It's going to make them vote for me. It's going to make them give me money. Other party officials are going to like me. So I'm going to say this false thing because the penalty, the media, giving me a hard time about it, that's not going to hurt me as much. I'm going to gain more points than I lose. Lie. So the guy lies. It's
just the guy.
It's a calculation. So how do we change that calculation? Well, it's an economy. It's a equation. So we just need to change the equation. How do we do that? Well, what do politicians need? What does every politician need? Advertising. They need advertising on Facebook, Google, TikTok, all the places so that they can reach their supporters and tell them stuff. So if those companies decide, okay, we're going to charge higher rates to politicians who have bad records for lying, they could do that. Nothing to stop them from doing that. And this was actually an idea for one of my students. So liars, 15% more. Honest politicians, 15% less. And so suddenly, lying's less attractive. wow, this is going to cost me because I have to advertise on Facebook, Instagram, all these places. And I may make a big stink about it, but I gotta advertise. And so if the tech companies got together, or I guess, if the tech companies did the same thing and said, yeah, we're not going to put up with this stuff, it could really make a difference. Another thing, take an idea from this conservative group, the Americans for Tax Reform. They have a pledge that they get Republicans to sign. We won't raise taxes. And most Republican candidates sign it. And they make a big deal. Like, I signed the pledge. And their leader, Grover Norquist, is just ferocious about this. So what if somebody like Grover had a pledge against lying, and that became a big thing? What if the Republicans took this on as their issue, and the Republicans said, you know what? We're going to become the party against lying. And we're going to stop lying, and we're going to challenge the Democrats to stop lying. That could make a difference.
I have two last really quick questions. One, I feel like I can't not ask it, and you briefly touched on it, is why is this or isn't this the most important US election?
Well, I hesitate to. I mean, I joked about it, but they say that every time, and you can always come up with some reason why it's the most important election. I just think everybody should vote, and everybody in every election.
Okay, and my final question, and I ask this to every podcast guest, is what is one thing that you would like a listener to take away from this episode?
Um, Stay informed, and if you wonder if something's true, look it up. There are so many good sources out there that don't necessarily believe what you hear. Go to good sources like PolitiFact, factcheck.org, the Washington Post fact checker, the fact checking teams of the AP, the New York Times. There's some tremendous fact checking out there, and check it out.
Amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed the entirety of our conversation. I've actually found it really cool to see the integration of PolitiFact into sites such as Meta and using more automated tools to sort of integrate the political fact checking. So when people, for listeners that don't know, when you go on something like TikTok, it's like, is this real or is it not? It's sites like PolitiFact that are helping to determine if it's actually real or not. And I think we're still kind of at the start of that sort of technology. But I'm excited as we move forward to see that more integrated, because I think that will truly hold, when you've got the masses understanding, is this real or is this not? That will really then encourage the politicians to be able to change themselves. I think it's fascinating hearing your journey from the inception of your idea and wanting to become a journalist, from hearing about those two stories and watching that film and hoping to become an attractive journalist, to going through becoming a plain journalist, to getting into fact checking, which is more important in the most important election of our lifetimes. So thank you so much, Bill, for your time.
Thank you, Harvey. Appreciate it.